what exactly does contemporary dance mean, because it's such a broad terminology. And if we look at the 20th century, all about all these modernist ideas to refusing the ballet and classical movements, because from one side contemporary kind of can include everything new, but because it's already been done for 100 years, how new can it be already? Do you know what I mean?
Well, contemporary, yes, it is a very wide spectrum, but contemporary, much like how modern was, modern was a breakaway from the classical and the traditional.
Yeah, yeah.
Contemporary and modern ultimately just meant anything that was not traditional folk or classical.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, contemporary very much aligns in that same facet. For me, contemporary just means now.
Yeah.
It's what's being created in the now,
Okay.
which is why there can be contemporary ballet. You know what I
Okay.
mean? Because it's ballet using the technique of ballet that is being created in the now. Contemporary elements are things that are manifested that are outside of the norm of the tradition and outside of the classical. I think that contemporary is a catch-all. It's
Yeah.
one of those umbrella terms that, depending upon who you ask, is going to have a different definition.
But I'm really, really interested in, like, if contemporary is really broad and it's about what's now and which can't be categorized by classical or traditional dance. Can we call hip hop dance a contemporary dance? Yes or no?
Yes, because hip hop was a break away from everything that was classical, everything that was traditional, and hip hop is an amalgamation. Like it's a fusion came together in urban environments in the United States. So hip hop itself is a blend of, like, when you talk about the musical aspect of hip
Mm-hmm.
hop, it's built off of samples.
Mm-hmm.
A hip hop beat was built off of all the music that came before it: jazz, R&B, funk, rock, soul, like all of the blues, all these different things were chopped and screwed and put into a format to then create what we understand hip hop music to be.
Okay.
But it was also created during a time where it was marginalized. Hip hop was a part of a marginalized community where it was not meant to be mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Hip hop was naturally associated with black people and people from urban environments, which were oftentimes degraded. Hip hop was a culture that was developed out of necessity because there was no platform for urban youth expression.
Mm-hmm.
It was a way for them to draw on all the things that had come before, the things that they'd learned from their parents,
Mm-hmm.
but then have something that was uniquely their own, but related to where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
So the musical composition, it couldn't have been classical because it drew from classical. It couldn't have been rock because it drew from rock. It couldn't have been R&B because it had all of these elements in it. It was something that was more of the time at that moment. It
Mm-hmm.
was contemporary at that moment. It was modern at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but now hip hop has spanned 40 years. So you might turn on a classic music station and hear an old hip hop song. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? So, like, classic again becomes a subjective, like, genre,
Yeah.
because classics have to do with how long something has existed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like classic hip hop. There's a particular thing that you're talking about with this subcategory. Now, for hip hop, definitely is it's contemporary because it continues to evolve.
Okay.
The hip hop that exists now, again, hip hop music and culture was never meant to be popular.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's not a more popular culture in the whole entire world than hip hop.
Mm-hmm.
Hip hop influences more cultures than they actually realize.
Yeah.
Hip hop is one of the only real, authentic, truly American things because America's a melting pot. It's an amalgamation. And hip hop is an amalgamation. And that is what's reflected to the rest of the world as a product of hip hop, even though it's associated with black Americans in hip hop. I mean, in terms of how it's projected, it is predominantly American. It is authentically American.
Contemporary dance in America and contemporary dance in Russia, are they completely different dance styles and genres? Because maybe in America people more influenced by hip hop and different dance influences, where in Russia, for example, like traditional dance and also some things that they into at the moment. Because in the different parts of the world you will have those traditional influences, it will affect the contemporary dance. Can we actually call
Yes.
those contemporary dances with the same tone? That's the thing as well.
Yes, you can. Again, these things it's just like anything else in life.
Yeah.
You can't take anything without its context.
Yeah.
So when somebody's talking about contemporary dance in Russia, it's defined by the Russian context. It's defined by what your culture understands contemporary to be in relationship to the classical or the tradition within that environment. And vice versa, it's the same thing in the United States. Contemporary is defined by what the classical or the things that came before it is. And naturally, contemporary is going to be different everywhere where you have a conversation about contemporary music or dance.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's, from the ethnochoreologist perspective, everything is contextually specific.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say it's contemporary in the United States when the same thing in the United States may not be seen as contemporary in Russia. So when you're
classical,
it's the same thing though. I mean, because you're getting into the notion of like these catch-alls or subjective terms that we have adopted as universal.
Yeah.
Like classical. All of these terms come from a very Eurocentric Western way of examining what that means.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, so again, like you're asking to apply a term to cultural contexts.
Okay.
And to me, the term is not universal.
Mm-hmm.
In Ethiopia, for instance, like in the States, we have modern dance. I'm considered I study traditional modern dance. I have an undergraduate in traditional modern dance based on traditional modern dance techniques. Graham, Horton, Taylor. These are known within the American institution of modern dance as the foundations of what we understand modern to be.
Mm-hmm.
But in Ethiopia, modern dance is anything that's not folk or traditional.
Okay.
So when I first moved to Ethiopia, and they would talk about modern dance, hip hop, salsa, ballet would even be considered modern dance because it's not their culture. Yeah. It's not their tradition. It's not their folk. It wouldn't be classical Ethiopian dance. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about Ethiopian music, like classical Ethiopian music is different than traditional Ethiopian music. It's different than contemporary. Mm-hmm. Classical Ethiopian music has all of these different modes. And then you have the classical Ethiopian music that's infused by the Europeans' concept of what classical music is. Mm-hmm. Just that piano music.
Yeah.
Piano's not a traditional instrument. It's not a classical instrument in Ethiopia. Okay. What does classical actually mean? Classical is the European way of saying traditional. Like these are new formulated traditions within the European way of living. That's what classical music became. How far do you have to dig back in Europe to dig back before like Mozart and all these other people and get to something traditional? What were the traditions before classical music in Europe?
Well, folk traditions for every single
but they're very it's very particular. Like, what were the folk traditions in England, in the United Kingdom? All their folk traditions were borrowed by their colonies,
Yeah,
were borrowed by the people that they colonized. Yes, there were folk traditions in places like Germany, and but those folk traditions are oftentimes marginalized in relationship to the propagation of classical music and classical traditions.
hmm
You know, so hip hop, again, coming back to hip hop and hip hop music, it is contemporary. It has to be. I think before the genre of hip hop existed, like when you go and buy music, it was probably put into a contemporary music category.
Do dancers create choreographers for club music, electronic dance music?
Yes, I think, yeah, they do.
Mhm.
I can't think of any off the top of my head right now, but I think a lot of choreographers are influenced by electronic music, especially nowadays because electronic music is a lot more popular.
Mhm.
There are some dancers that specify in choreographing like house dancing. You know what I mean? Like, and that's considered electronic music.
Mhm.
So, but house also is a genre of hip hop. Format in which electronic music is built off of the same format of how you take music samples and put them together to make hip hop beats.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? So there are students, choreographers, and companies that utilize electronic music as a crux of some of their creative processes.
Mhm.
You know, I definitely feel that some people are inspired by that particular musical genre. And there are people that are, there's some people that get into the craft of creating dance
Mhm.
after being involved in the social activity.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like, there are a lot of choreographers that I know, like Ron Brown, for instance, in his company Evidence, is considered an Afro modern or a contemporary modern dance company that infuses a lot of African traditions. But prior to him becoming a choreographer, he was a house dancer.
Okay, all right.
So the influence of house dance in his contemporary and modern dance choreography is evident
Yeah.
if you know the cultures. So with dance, it's the same. I think, and you can answer this about music, but for me, one of the great things about being an ethnochoreologist and then also being very drawn to culture and
Mhm.
trying to find the ways to connect the dots of how cultures
Mhm.
are just human. Um, you start to see the way in which people draw from other cultures to
Mhm.
create particular types of choreography. But you won't know that they're drawing from these cultures unless you've been exposed to the culture. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
if I didn't know all of the traditional movements that I've been exposed to,
Mhm.
I wouldn't be able to watch somebody dancing a hip hop choreography and say, hey, they just threw in some Irish traditional step dance there.
Mm. Okay.
Or wait, they're using some real West African tradition in that particular movement. Oh, but wait, you see people do that in capoeira. Because with hip hop dance, you had Latin influence. You had like the salsa that was, from the Latin Caribbean community in Puerto Rico and in Cuba and in other places in South America. You also had African influence, like the general, African traditions that people were exposed to. You had the social dance influence of like R&B, and then the social dance influence of dances during the 1930s, like the Charleston. You know what I mean? There are certain things that influence the way that people were interpreting what they saw.
Mhm.
So when it comes to the urban experience or the black experience in America and what we transmit that becomes, parts of popular culture, hip hop
Mhm.
specifically, it's our exposure to these other cultures that were around that we then embody and transmit through our own experiences that
Mhm.
make hip hop what it is. There was nothing new that was being created. It was just how these pieces were being fused together to present something that seemed new.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you weren't exposed to all the cultures that were influencing hip hop, then you don't know that these cultures influenced hip hop. Even gymnastics.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Russian gymnasts, this is very specific. The Russian gymnasts were oftentimes used as references in certain movement, like windmills. Like it's the thing that you do on the pommel horse.
Mm-hmm.
And I know growing up in the 80s, there were movies like Gymkhana that were like this Russian gymnast who was running around flipping all over stuff, and that influenced hip hop culture. Because I know that all urban people were watching these types of movies, you know? So this brings up something that is a part of my own concepts that I'm exploring in my own writing and research, the notion of movement citation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you're a musician, you can cite where you learned something specific because music is so codified in that way. You know what I mean? Like it's a technique.
With the different movements and gestures.
Yes. With dance, it's more challenging because it's not as codified. It's not as written down as music is.
Yeah.
So the notion of movement citation is being able to identify where the influence of particular movement is in your creative process. This is something that I'm constantly like thinking about when I move. When I teach, it's like, oh, this is from my grand class. Oh, this is from how I used to dance when I was a kid. Oh, this is from that house. You know, it's like all of these things are a part of my creative process. But because I'm the type of artist that I am, it's important for me to connect those lineages. Why? So I can pass it down. Because in the age of popular culture, everything is just becoming popularized. So the notion of the traditions or the lineages of where things have come from, younger generations don't really care about as much. And this is very true even in a place like Ethiopia that's seeped in traditional dance and in traditional music. Nowadays, the young kids care less about knowing the meanings behind their traditional movement and more about amalgamating these traditions with modern dances. You know what I mean? So there is something to be said about knowing the influences of the genres or the cultures that we're now reflecting. Hip hop specifically is just like an amalgamation of world culture through the lens of the African American experience.
Just say, for example, that contemporary dance kind of bring all of this underground movements and waves and styles into the one thing.
Yes, that's what I was saying before. Contemporary is like the catch-all.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, so you could create a house dance, but depending upon what environment you present it in, or the type of integrity or the lens through which you create or how you see yourself, you may call your house dance contemporary dance. It may be associated with a contemporary genre because it's not classical and it's not traditional, but 20 years from now, you know, house dancing may be considered a folk dance. You know, you never know. 50 years from now, it's like the way that we look at what folk is, because when you start talking about folk, you're talking about something that is not even in opposition, but it came before the notion of this kind of general universal theme about how we all should be living in a modern world, which again is attributed to the Eurocentric lens through which the whole entire world views our human experience. You know, there's not a place in the world that's not affected by colonization, by European colonization. So when we use these terms, that's the lens through which we're examining them. Okay. And it doesn't always work the same way. It could work in the United States and in America because that's in America. It's a very European-based country, the United States. Everything that we have in the States is based off of these ideas that came from Europe. Even though there are influences from other traditions and other cultures around the world, it has to meet this European standard. But when you go into indigenous cultures and you start to talk to them about the folk versus the tradition and the contemporary, they're ultimately going to have to view it through the lens of the European. There's no way to associate these particular terms to their culture because they don't have any concept of these things until Europeans brought them. You weren't thinking about your tradition in Africa as traditional dance or folk dance or classical dance.
Mhm.
It was just, what you did in a reflection to the functionality of your environment.
Depends where you are. In the context of Russia, it'll be different than in context of the UK. If we speak about the UK, in the university, the classical faculty, then they call it contemporary classical, which I would say relates more to modernism, modern dance, modern
Yeah.
music.
But I
And,
think what they're
then
calling it is an attempt to play the style of classical music
I
in
wouldn't say, not really, not the classical music refers to Western classical music,
yes,
European Western classical music,
yes,
Mozart, Beethoven, Ravel.
yes,
And
yes.
then when we speak about contemporary classical music, we're speaking specifically about music of 20th century, like John Cage, Stockhausen, let's say,
John Cage is not classical music.
is not classical, but contemporary classical.
No, it's contemporary. Like, cause to me, it's like this is the thing. Like,
Listen,
how do you call? Cause when John Cage was creating what he created, it was contemporary. It was not considered classical. You know what I mean? So now, this is why I'm saying these things are subjective. So now that John Cage is old, what he was doing is now classical contemporary. You know what I mean?
But, I'm trying to say slightly different thing, that
Okay.
in music, for example, classical music, end of 19th century, there was a race of classical music, Rachmaninoff, beginning of 20th century, end of 19th century, everything is great, tonality, beautiful music, la 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 la. And then composers start to experiment. They start to refuse the ideas of tonality, of a scale, and they start to look for different ways of expression. But the computers didn't exist, and lots of different tools didn't exist. Also, First World War, Second World War, and because of that, the music is very it's atonal.
Hmm.
It's maybe not as pleasant to listen to, but the concepts kind of dominated over the tonality and the classic
Yes.
ideas. So in music, this period called modernism and the music of the 20th century. In the 21st century, what's happened with the music? The technologies evolved, and some of the composers who still really kind of stuck together with the idea of the 20th century, they still carrying on, refusing to use the technology, and they still looking at the concepts of different way of expression, like
So
modernism.
they'd be classical.
So those composers at the moment in
Yeah.
the academia, musicians called contemporary classical. Okay, they don't use
Okay.
technologies, but they avant-garde atonal music.
Okay.
And
Why
then we
can't we
have
just call it avant-garde atonal music? Why does it have to be called contemporary classical?
lots of things in and then we also have a popular music and electronic music. Okay, so popular music and electronic music, they wasn't accepted for quite a while in the universities, not anymore, but it's already in the universities. And then you would have actually those categories which were created by people in Europe, yes. Classical music, contemporary classical music, and then you can either choose electronic or popular culture. And this is why I'm asking those questions. Where in dance, it's different. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it is slightly different in dance, but I think that if you were to ask somebody different who actually is who researches
Hmm.
this notion of classical and contemporary within the dance genre. They may have something that fits more in alignment with what you're saying.
Mhm.
From my experience with dance specifically, the notion of contemporary is not really associated with that modernist period. You know what I mean?
Okay, that's
Like
the main
that modernist period
yeah.
would be the same for dance. The early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, like it's all about that was the birth of modern. You know, that was the age where there was a disconnect between the rigidity of ballet and an attempt to find different ways of expression without that same level of structure.
Mm-hmm.
But early modern dance was either a real stark contrast to what ballet was, or it was built off of the techniques of ballet
Mm-hmm.
and just certain and modernized in a way,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And when it comes to contemporary, I don't really know if the term contemporary dance was used until the early 20, like the late 20th century, early 21st century, you know?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think because modern was so prevalent, and even after modern dance in the 70s, is in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, is when postmodern dance came about.
Mm.
Classical dance is centered around ballet. And we're looking at the European perspective, like we're looking at Eurocentric, classical, traditional sort of dancing. Classical dance is ballet, is the crux. It's so then when we get into modern was a deviation from the classical, but it still was about being a dancer. I think modern may have engaged with certain human themes in a different way and looked at cultures in a different way than ballet was doing,
Mm-hmm.
because ballet was more, I don't even want to say appropriating, but like ballet didn't necessarily have as much exposure to a lot of the cultures that it may have been reflecting from time to time. Many of the early modern dancers would have had some exposure to Egypt and all these places and were influenced by them. The Doris Humphreys and all of these people back in the day were influenced by a lot of the things that they had been exposed to culturally, and you could see that influence in their work, the early modern dance. Then we get into the 60s and the 70s, and postmodern dance reiterates or reinfuses this idea that anybody can be a dancer. You don't have to have dance technique, ballet or modern dance technique to be a dancer, and reintroduce the idea of pedestrian style of movement. That's where contact improvisation came into play. This was all part of the postmodern dance time period.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes into the 80s and into the early 90s. So at that time, traditional modern dance was still being studied. It was still very prevalent and prominent. Postmodern dance is making its way in. Nowadays, because of the notion of popularity with dance, contemporary dance became this catch-all umbrella because of shows like So You Think You Can Dance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there was not one way to present all of these styles of movement and these types of choreographers without a catch-all umbrella thing. You know what I mean? Like, so this is a contemporary dance show that features contemporary dance, but it may be more contemporary ballet, it may be contemporary hip hop, it may be contemporary traditional African dance. It's through this catch-all umbrella because it's in the now.
I got it.
I hope it helped.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome very much.
Hello.
Hello.
Ah!
Yeah.
I miss you guys, man.
What does it mean, contemporary? Contemporary, is it modern? Is it combination of modern dance and traditional dance.
Yeah, even for myself, that I have been immersed in this dance field, it's quite combination of eras as well. Classical ballet as the primary technical dance structure. After that, it becomes the rupture about classical dance, and it's come the modern dance, what is just like slightly the breakthrough, not using the point shoes, just doing things barefoot. With Isadora Duncan, for example, she's one of the breaking the classical stereotypes. And then I think that's the first point of break about dance technique with Isadora Duncan. And after that, other dancers appear with that kind of revelation again, like not being so structured or not having the same language for dance. So appears Martha Graham, appears Doris Humphrey, but they again start to find their own technique. That's kind of the same thing about classical. I mean, they wanted to break it, but then they start their own technique. And again, it's several steps, like very classified. So it's just a different way to perceive dance and a different way of create choreography, for example, and different elements about the barefoot, about the use of the torso and dynamics, etc. But for me, like for me appears another wave or another breakthrough, it's when postmodern dance appears. There is talking more about the concept, as you said, about music. Here is again around 60s, 70s, where other thoughts about the body and about the use of the body, about the use of the space, the use of the music, for me changes. And I can perceive like this new breakthrough, and it's around 60s and 70s where the postmodern dance appears. And for example, here there's a breakthrough as well with the music, because they start to think about what about silence, what about the use of sounding elements, that it doesn't have to be like a big composition, music composition. So it's where, for me, it's where the real the real breakthrough in dance appears. All that is not ballet, it's a contemporary form, just because it's not classical, you know. Like some people just consider like hip hop and urban styles like contemporary.
I think in the dance education, we definitely have classical ballet, and then we have this idea of like modern, and then we have contemporary. Some people call the modern contemporary as well. So some people say we have classical technique in the form of ballet, and we have contemporary. I would say a lot of the contemporary we do, especially in the UK, is Cunningham technique. You know, Cunningham worked a lot with John Cage. But for me, that's modern, along with Martha Graham, Isadora Duncan, all these people, because in the 70s, 80s, there was a group in New York called Judson Church Group, and they kind of started this postmodern era. And it's this postmodern that I would refer to as more contemporary. And this postmodern, they were breaking the boundaries of what had become modern dance. Modern dance still has elements of ballet in there, like Cunningham. It's still got like straight lines, extensions, jumps. You know, it's just they've broken the classical form a little bit, but it still depends on the same principles. In this postmodern, probably similar to music as well, they started then maybe going a bit more minimalist, you know, and looking a bit more pedestrian, like asking this question, what is dance? If I just walk, am I dancing? And this kind of started shaping what we call postmodern or contemporary dance. But this is still a little bit subjective, this contemporary term. And with that, there's like somatic practice comes into it, which is like movement for everyone, really. It's like a well-being thing. Somatics, people can do like Alexander technique. You've probably heard of. Musicians often take Alexander technique. But then this started kind of combining a little bit with contemporary dance. So then there's like a somatic contemporary dance style. So I'd say that's kind of one subcategory. When you're asking about hip hop and TikTok, these other things, I wouldn't call them part of contemporary dance. I think they're their own genre. Like hip hop is its own genre, ballet is its own genre, Ceilidh dancing is its own genre. But I think what's interesting in contemporary dance is the way contemporary dance. Okay, so in work, it can work in two ways. You can work with a choreographer that goes, right, this is the shapes 5, 6, 7, 8, and you copy me, right? Choreographers, directors work in a way of, okay, what's your experience? What does your body do? How do you move? How can I use that and compose that in space? So they work with the dancer's interpretation of movement, interpretation of ideas. So they might give a creative task like, I want you to create a duet where he never touches the floor, you know, and that can be for whatever reason. The director might have their own reason for giving that task, but then we create the movement as dancers. So we have a creative input, and that's a lot more a way that I prefer to work, because I enjoy being creative. So I have this, but then what comes with that is if you take a break dancer that's maybe done a little bit of contemporary training, you give them a task, they're going to use their foundation, their experience. So breakdance or hip hop will come into that contemporary style, but it wouldn't just be hip hop because you're taking it out of the context of hip hop. You see what I mean? You're placing it somewhere else. And also because you're combining it then maybe with someone else that does Ceilidh dancing. And when you put those two bodies together to create something interesting happens. They don't have breakdance skills, so they don't do breakdance. But you take the breakdance and put them with this person. It's like alchemy, no chemistry. It's like something. There's a response. So I think contemporary dance is definitely influenced by lots of these other genres, and I think there's a lot of autonomy and individualness within contemporary dance in terms of the movement language. For me as well in the UK, I find the academia very stuck in time. Like I said, it's still very much focused a lot on modern, not so much the postmodern. And there's very contemporary dance styles. So then with this idea that in postmodern people started embodying their own movement language rather than being like, right, everyone do what Cunningham does, copy this choreographer, and then that's a technique. People have started, okay, well, I do breakdance and I do Cunningham and I do, poetry, and now I'm going to make my own style. And I think there's lots of these subsets. So then people start giving names to their own techniques. So there's a guy from the 80s, he's created a technique called flying low in Brussels. But that's very trendy now. It's gone all over the world. There's people teaching it all over now, and it's very popular. And people in the universities, some take them in as guest teachers to teach the students. Other universities like, no, this is just a trend. It's not your foundation. Your foundation is your modern dance, your ballet. That's your foundation. When you leave, you can do what you want. But these foundations.
But do the professors, dance teachers, dance professors, do they kind of do they think it's like it's not, it's something underground, easy peasy?
I don't know. I think it's very subjective, because when I was at Laban, I think there was some of the teachers in charge of programming and stuff, they were older. And then I think, are they a little bit stuck with what they know from when they trained up from a certain time, and I think for them, I think they have their own arrogance of like, no, this is dance, this is how I know dance, and this is how good dancers have been trained 20 years ago. But they can't, I think they're a little bit blind. They can't see what's happening now. They only know what they know from 20 years ago. Other times, I think it can be that they think, this isn't challenging, or they might think that it isn't codified yet because, Cunningham, he started in 70s, 80s or something, so like it's 30 years, well, now 50 years, that like he's styles being kind of practiced. So there's time that kind of reinforces its value.
Mm-hmm.
With something maybe more new, I guess they don't see the value in it because it hasn't had that time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but I think it's different than another. If you have like a younger director or whatever, because this is it, when you deal with art, it's so much about artistic vision, right? And whatever director's in at that time, they have their vision, and I think everyone has a slightly different vision. And the teachers that are in quite often, so like if you have contemporary technique, I think it's a little bit open in the sense of like, I guess in music you have your classical, your contemporary classical, your electronic, and the other one. But I guess there's very strict rules on what makes that style. Whereas in contemporary dance, you can say you've got contemporary, but you could have two teachers teaching contemporary, and it can be very different. Like the rules are very loose and open. I think that the teacher can teach whatever they want, really, as long as they can validate it. I think there's definitely a similar kind of arrogance, I think, but I don't think there's many alternatives. If you want to train as a dancer, I think you've either got classical school or contemporary school. If you want to do hip hop, you do like drop-in classes, like a Thursday evening hip hop class. You pay £5, you go. I don't think there's actually, no, there are starting to be a few more urban courses, but there's very few. I don't think there's many options to do something.
And what about like trad dance, traditional dance? Is it something that exists maybe in different schools, or how does it?
Not so much in contemporary schools, I don't think. I guess you're referring to more like folk kind of dance. Yeah, some choreographers might bring it in if they make like either choreographer you work with, or when you're in the school, sometimes they bring the guest choreographers in to make work. If that choreographer has an interest in traditional dance, they might bring parts of that into the work, but it's not something we study as such.
So it really depends on who's teaching you, right?
Yeah. But even then, if a teacher is teaching you contemporary, and they might have bits of traditional or folk dance there, but it wouldn't be a folk dance traditional class. It might have bits that they've taken. Maybe they were a folk dancer, became a contemporary performer, and folk dance somehow informs their dance practice, but it isn't. That isn't what it is. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Another question is about the music for contemporary dance. Yes. So because I'm looking at this culture, subculture, and how they merge together, do choreographers use lots of electronic dance music which can be used in clubs?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think different with different choreographers, but I definitely think that there are some choreographers that use that. I think there's choreographers that use trance dance music that exists, like maybe they might use Prodigy in a dance piece, or otherwise they might use trance dance music that's been created for that work, but yeah, I definitely think that happens, and something that you would listen to and could be played in the club, like Prodigy is played in the club, or music that's written for that obviously wouldn't be played in the club, but would be suitable to be played in the club, if that makes sense.
Okay, that was all my questions.
Great. No, good.